The wind came off the ridge like a blade itself. Cora drove the scythe low across the wheat teeth, shut shoulders locked. The stalks fell in a pale curtain, and she stepped forward before they settled, already pulling back for the next cut. She did not look at the sky. She knew what the sky looked like. She'd known since dawn, when the clouds bunched up yellow-green above Devil's Spine and the limestone started giving off that smell, wet iron-cold stone, the smell that meant the season was ending, whether she was ready or not. 47 acres. She had 7 hours of useful light, and a body that had stopped feeling her fingers sometime around noon. The scythe sang through another row. She counted the rows the way her father taught her, not forward to what was left, but backward from what was done. 12. 13. Don't look at the field. Look at what's behind you. On stroke 14, the blade caught a buried rock. The sound it made was short. Final. A clang like a church bell struck with a hammer. She stood holding the handle. The iron head lay 6 feet away in the wheat split at the neck. The break was clean. Old metal. Nothing to be done. Her right hand was bleeding where the vibration had opened a cut across the heel of her palm. She pressed it against her apron and looked at the field. 33 rows still standing. The clouds now reached the midpoint of the sky. 3 hours. Maybe less. She dropped to her knees and started breaking the wheat by hand. Her fingers found the stalks, bent them, snapped them. It was slow. It was half the speed, maybe less. Her knuckles whitened and reddened in turns. She did not stop. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Heavy, unhurried. Not coming from the road, coming from above, from the scrub pine line at the ridge's foot. She turned without standing up. He was large enough that she registered size before face, wide through the chest, a beard gone half-gray. Scarred along the left jaw and down the neck, the kind of scars that come from something other than farming accidents. He carried nothing in his hands. He stopped 12 feet away and looked at the broken scythe head in the wheat, then at her hands, then at the field. She had heard everything the town said about Silas Rourke. She'd heard it the way you hear weather reports, with the understanding that what actually arrives may not match the description. He picked up the broken blade, crouched down, pulled a whetstone from his coat pocket, and began working the iron, not the break that was gone, but the remaining edge of the shorter piece, the flat 1.5 inches that still held an angle. His hands moved without hurry. She watched the stone pass over the metal again. The sound was soft, patient. He held the shortened blade up, tested the edge against his thumb. Set it back in the handle socket, took out a strip of rawhide, and lashed it tight. Then he looked up. Let me help with the harvest. His voice was low, used infrequently. I've got no skill with hope, but these hands know the work. He stood, picked up the scythe, and walked to the next uncut row. Cora did not move. The wind pressed the wheat flat and let it rise again. Blood dried on her palm in a dark line. She had maybe 2 hours of light, left a man she couldn't name as friend or threat, and 33 rows of wheat between her and everything her father left her. She stood up and followed him into the field. They found a rhythm. Silas cut. Cora bound. She'd gather 10 stalks, twist a handful around the middle, tuck the end under the knot her father showed her at age 6, the one that didn't slip even wet. Behind her, the bound sheaves stood in rows pale gold against the darkening sky. Her hands stopped bleeding. The cold had closed the cut. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The work didn't need words. By the time the first horses appeared on the ridge road, they had cleared nearly half the remaining rows. She heard Vance before she saw him. He had that kind of laugh, the kind that wasn't really a laugh, just a sound a man makes to let you know he's already decided how this ends. 3 riders. Vance in front, 2 of Harlan's ranch hands flanking him. He pulled up at the field's edge and sat his horse with the easy weight of a man who'd never had to hurry for anything. Well, He looked at the sheaves, then at Silas. "Didn't know you'd hired yourself a dancing bear, Cora." She kept her hands moving, twisted another bundle, tucked the end. Vance walked his horse slowly along the field's border. He wasn't looking at the wheat anymore. He was looking at the wagon, the old flatbed her father had built, the one she'd loaded the morning's cut onto. He rode alongside it casual like a man out for an afternoon, and then his boot came out and caught the wheel housing. The axle pin sheared with a crack like a pistol shot. The near wheel folded. The wagon tilted. 3 hours of bound wheat shifted, and half of it slid into the dirt. Vance watched it happen with his hands loose on the reins. "Shame," he said. "Looks like your cart's broken. Hard to haul grain without a cart." He glanced at Silas at the slow, deliberate way he'd been working. "Maybe your bear can carry it on his back. Looks like he moves about that fast anyway." One of the hands laughed. Cora's knees hit the ground beside the wheat. She started gathering it back by hand because her body didn't know what else to do, because stopping meant thinking about what Vance had just taken from her, and she could not afford to think about that yet. Her throat closed. Her eyes burned. She pressed her forehead against a bound sheaf and felt the dry stalks scratch her skin, and she held that the scratch, the smell of cut grain and cold air, held it, instead of the other thing that was trying to come up through her chest. Silas set down the scythe. He walked to the pine stand at the field's north edge. The trees there were second growth, close together, one of them storm-felled and half-cut, already the trunk lying at an angle against its neighbors. He pulled the long knife from his belt, not a fighting knife, a working one wide at the base, the handle wrapped in dark leather, and went to the fallen trunk. He didn't hurry. He didn't look at Vance. The knife came down. Once. The sound was different from a scythe, heavier, more final. He worked down the trunk in sections, turning the wood with his free hand between cuts, shaping something. The chips came off clean and pale, and the smell of fresh pine cut through the cold air sharp enough that even Vance's horse raised its head. 12 minutes. Maybe 15. Silas carried the finished piece back to the wagon. It was a near-perfect hexagonal axle section tapered at both ends to match the original housing. He crouched, lifted the wagon frame with one shoulder, seated the new axle, and let the wheel drop back onto it. He stood up and put his boot against the wheel. It didn't move. He looked at Vance then. Just looked. The way a man looks at something he's already accounted for and found unworthy of further attention. Vance's horse shifted under him. The two hands had gone quiet. "Load the wheat," Silas said. "To Cora, not to them." She stood up. She loaded the wheat. Vance said nothing else. He turned his horse and rode back toward the road, and his men went with him, and the only sound left was the wind and the knock of sheaves being lifted onto a flatbed by two sets of hands. Cora stacked a bundle without looking up. Her jaw ached from holding it shut. She did not ask how he'd known the exact dimensions. She did not ask where he'd learned to work wood like that. But the question sat in her chest the rest of the afternoon, quiet and insistent the way a splinter sits before you know it's there. A man who could do what he just did, why was he living alone on a rock face above a town that called him useless? The miller's boy was 12 years old, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. Pa says he can't take it. He stood in the doorway of the grist mill with his cap in both hands, turning it around and around. Says the wheel's broke. Says it's been broke since Tuesday. The wheel was not broke. Cora could hear it turning from where she stood. She looked past the boy into the mill. She could see lantern light moving shadows, someone in there working. She looked back at the boy. He turned his cap around again. "Tell your father I understand," she said. She walked back to the wagon. Silas sat on the bench, reins loose across his knee, watching the mill door. She climbed up and took the reins from him and turned the horses without a word. Harlan hadn't even needed to be here. That was the part that sat wrong in her stomach the whole drive back. He'd made one visit, said whatever he said, and now every door in the valley would close the same way quietly, with an apology by someone who wouldn't look at her face. The first snow came before they reached the barn. Not heavy yet. Just the advanced small dry flakes that the wind caught and drove sideways, the kind that melted on contact, but meant the real storm was 2 hours behind them at most. She lit the lantern. Silas unhitched the horses and got them into the stalls and forked hay without being asked. She stood in the middle of the barn floor, surrounded by a full wagon of grain she couldn't sell in a county, where the only buyer had just closed his door on orders from a man who'd been planning this since before the first seed went in the ground. She sat down on the wagon bed and put her face in her hands, not crying, just putting her face somewhere dark and still for a moment. Just that. She heard Silas move. She heard him go to the tool wall and take something down the tin of pine pitch by the sound of it. She heard him light a second lantern from the first, then a third from the second. She looked up. He had pulled the first wagon load onto the barn floor and was opening the burlap sacks. He set 2 empty feed bins side by side. Then he picked up a handful of stalks from the nearest sack and held it under the lantern, turning it, slowly examining it, the way a man reads a letter written in a language he has to think in. He separated a portion out, set it in the right-hand bin, then another handful, examined it, set the main portion in the left bin, a small portion in the right. "What are you doing?" she said. "Sorting." "Sorting what?" "It's all grain." He didn't answer. He picked up the next handful. The snow hit the roof hard enough to hear it change from the soft, irregular tap of the advance to the steady hiss of the real storm arriving. The temperature dropped inside the barn. She could see her breath. The horses shifted and stamped. Silas sorted. He worked like a man who had nowhere else to be. No hurry, no wasted motion. Each handful examined each separated portion, placed with the same deliberate care. The right-hand bin began to fill not with wheat, but with darker stalks, root clusters still attached where the harvesting had pulled them up from the limestone soil. She'd thought them weeds. She'd nearly told him twice today to leave them behind. He hadn't. An hour passed. Maybe more. She found herself pulling bundles from the sacks and passing them to him because it was something to do, and standing still in the cold felt worse. He accepted them without acknowledgement and kept working. The storm outside had settled into something serious. The barn walls flexed and held. The lanterns swayed. She watched his hands move through the dark stalks, careful, methodical, almost gentle. And the question from the afternoon came back and sat down next to her like a third person in the barn. He was sorting like a man who knew exactly what he was looking for, and she still didn't know what that was. Harlan came at first light, 4 riders. A buckboard with 2 men holding the deed box between them, like it was already done. Harlan himself in the lead, sitting his horse with the particular comfort of a man who has never once arrived somewhere to find things other than he expected. Cora stood in the barn doorway. The snow had stopped before dawn, but it lay 6 inches deep across the yard, unmarked except for the horses' tracks coming down the road. Silas was already on the wagon bench. She didn't question it. She climbed up. He slapped the reins hard, and the horses lurched forward, and she grabbed the bench rail with both hands as the wagon came out of the barn at a speed it was not built for, the sorted bins in the bed, shifting and thudding, the new axle holding. "The road's that way," she said. "I know where the road is." He turned the horses north. She heard Harlan shout behind them, heard the buckboards break, release hooves, and snowmen calling to each other. Then she looked ahead, and her stomach dropped to the floor of the wagon. Devil's Spine rose out of the valley's north end, like something the earth had shoved up in anger, a limestone ridge running east to west sheer on the valley side. A narrow game trail switchbacking up the face between outcroppings glazed with last night's ice. No wheel had ever gone up that trail. Everyone in the county knew it. Everyone in the county said so. "Silas, hold the rail." He stood up on the bench. Not to see better, to feel the wagon's balance through his legs the way a man feels a boat in water. He worked the reins with both hands, not pulling, talking to the horses in short, low sounds that weren't quite words. The front wheels hit the trail's first rise and the whole wagon lurched sideways. She threw her weight right without thinking, following some instinct, and felt the wheel catch and hold. He glanced at her. Once. Then back at the trail. Behind them, Harlan's riders reached the trail's foot and stopped. She heard the argument, one man willing to, not Harlan's voice rising. Then silence from below, which meant they'd made their decision. The trail was not meant for wagons. The limestone pushed through the snow in shelves and angles, and the horses had to be walked through each turn one careful step at a time, while the valley floor dropped away below the right side wheels at a distance that made looking a mistake. Cora looked. She stopped looking. Silas read the trail like it was text. He'd pull left before she could see why, and 3 seconds later the right wheel would pass over a buried shelf that would have caught and flipped them. He'd speak to the near horse, one word, a sound really, and the animal would lean into the collar differently, redistributing weight she couldn't calculate, but he already had. Once on the third switchback, the rear wheels broke loose on a patch of bare ice and the wagon came around sideways toward the edge. Her grip on the rail went white. The drop below was long enough that she couldn't see what was at the bottom. Silas stepped one foot onto the sideboard, shifted his body out over the downhill side, and the counterweight brought the rear wheels back. Just. The horses found purchase and pulled. The wagon straightened. He stepped back onto the bench like a man stepping off a porch. Her lungs had stopped at the start of that slide and started again when the wagon straightened, and she had not noticed either event until now. The crest came without announcement, just the trail leveling. Suddenly, the wind changing direction, and on the other side a long slope dropping gently toward a different valley, a different color of sky, a road. She didn't know that ran east toward the territorial line. He let the horses walk. Behind them over the ridge, the valley with Harlan and Vance and the closed mill and the lease that expired at noon lay completely out of reach. The wagon creaked. Snow fell off a pine branch somewhere below them, a soft collapse. Cora released the rail. Her hand had been closed so long the fingers didn't straighten fully. She looked at them, white, then red, then the deep ache of blood returning. She looked at Silas. He was already watching the road ahead, both hands quiet on the reins, now the horses breathing in long plumes of steam in the cold air. Whatever he was, whatever the town had decided he had just taken a loaded wagon over an iced mountain trail that 3 of Harlan's paid men wouldn't follow. And he had. They found a rock overhang 2 miles down the eastern slope wide enough to pull the wagon under and get out of the wind. Silas set the brake and climbed down. He went to the horses first, checked their legs. Their hooves ran his hands down each flank, the way you check something you nearly broke and need to know is still whole. Then he sat down on a stone near the wagon wheel and put his hands on his knees. That was when she saw them. The palms were torn open across the base of both thumbs. Not cuts, tears where the skin had pulled away from gripping the reins hard through wet leather on ice. The right hand was worse. The rawhide wrap of the reins had printed itself into the flesh in a dark crosshatch, and 2 of the fingernails had split to the quick. He hadn't made a sound. Not on the trail. Not now. She pulled at the hem of her underskirt until a strip came free. Then another. She crouched in front of him and held out her hand for his. He looked at her hand. Then he turned his palm up. She worked without speaking. The cloth was rough, but it was clean, and she wound it tight the way you wrap something that needs pressure more than comfort. His hands were large enough that her strips barely covered, and she tore more and kept going. He held still and let her. When she finished the right hand, she started on the left. The fire she'd built from pine scraps in the overhang gave just enough light to see by. Outside, the wind worked through the spruce line in long pulses. "You knew the trail," she said. Not a question. "Ran it a few times. No wagon, though." She tied off the last strip. You could have told me that before we went up. You'd have argued. She looked up at him. He was watching the fire. I don't argue, she said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, just a small shift there and gone. She sat back on her heels. The fire popped. One of the horses blew a long breath in the dark. 10 years ago, he said. She went still. I had a place. 200 acres on the Callaway Flat. Good soil, not ridge rock like yours, real bottomland. He turned his right hand over and looked at the wrapping. A man came through selling futures contracts on the Eastern Rail Line. Said the spur was going through Callaway in the spring and land values would triple. I signed. The fire settled lower. She didn't move to feed it. The spur didn't go through Callaway. The contract had a clause I didn't read it through, or I read it and didn't understand what I was reading. Either way, it meant the same thing. When the rail missed us, I owed the difference between what the land was worth and what I'd borrowed against. He stopped, looked at the spruce line outside. My wife took the children to her sister's place in February. By March, the land was gone. The wind came through hard, and the fire bent sideways and came back. I moved up to the ridge because nobody wanted the ridge. Nobody had a contract on it. Nobody could take it. He looked at his wrapped hands. I work slow because slow is how you see the trap before you step in it. That's all. Cora looked at the grain bins in the wagon bed, the 2 piles Silas had sorted through the night. The dark stalks with the root clusters. She'd wanted to leave them in the field. She thought about that. She looked at his hands. You saw something in that field today, she said. When Vance laughed at you for pulling up weeds with the wheat. He looked at her then. Direct the way he'd looked at Vance across the repaired wagon. But different. Quieter. They weren't weeds, he said. The fire cracked. A coal broke apart and dimmed. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He pulled his coat tighter and leaned his head back against the rock and closed his eyes, and the question of what was in those bins sat between them in the dark, like something alive, something that would not wait past morning to show itself. Don't said a single word about it. The Army Depot sat at the edge of Millhaven, a long, low building with a territorial flag gone stiff. In the cold, 2 soldiers at the door and a quartermaster inside who had the particular look of a man who'd seen every kind of desperate come through his door and had stopped feeling bad about turning most of them away. His name was Briggs. He had a ledger open on the counter and a pen in his hand before they'd finished setting the brake. Wheat, he said, looking at the wagon. Price is down. Storm's brought 3 loads in this morning already. 2 loads, Silas said. The wheat and something else. Briggs looked up. Silas lifted the first bin over the wagon rail himself, hands wrapped, moving careful. He set it on the depot floor in front of the counter. The dark root clusters lay packed in dense, tangled rows, still carrying the limestone soil between the rootlets, the way Silas had sorted them to keep the roots intact. The smell came up immediately in the closed room. Sharp, medicinal, something between pine resin and turned earth. Briggs set his pen down. He came around the counter slowly. He crouched in front of the bin. He picked up 1 root cluster and held it to the light from the depot window, turning it, examining the way the root branched the dark color of the outer skin against the pale inner flesh where a rootlet had broken. He set it down. He stood up. He looked at Silas. Where did you pull these? Blackwood Ridge. West Slope limestone shelf grows in with the wheat. How much you got? Second bin on the wagon. 45 pounds root weight after sorting. Briggs went to the door and said something to one of the soldiers outside. The soldier left at a trot. Briggs came back and stood behind his counter and opened a different ledger, a smaller one from a locked drawer. Cora looked at Silas. He was watching Briggs the way he watched everything still complete, nothing wasted. What is it? She said quietly. Black Mountain Senna. Grows wild in limestone country. Army's been buying every root pound it can find for 2 years, Treat infected wounds, field surgeons use it. He kept his eyes on Briggs. It only grows in 3 counties I know of. Blackwood Ridge is one. She thought of Harlan, his pressure on the mill, his patience, years of it, working her father's debt slowly, no hurry. Waiting. He hadn't wanted the wheat. He'd never wanted the wheat. Briggs looked up from his ledger. He said a number. Cora heard it. The room did not change, same cold air, same smell of pine and old paper, but something in her chest released all at once like a knot pulled from the wrong end for so long that when the right end finally gave it, went completely. She put both hands flat on the counter. The number Briggs had said was 4 times what the farm had earned in its last 3 years combined. They settled accounts in an hour. Briggs took the center root, all of it. He took the wheat at the lower price and didn't argue. He counted out in government scrip and then in coin because they didn't have enough scrip, and when it was done, the leather pouch Cora put in her coat pocket had a weight to it she'd never felt before. She walked out into the cold and stood beside the empty wagon. Silas came out behind her. He pulled on his coat. He looked at the horses, then at the road north back toward the ridge. He began to untie the lead rope from the depot post. Silas! He stopped. She reached into her other coat pocket, the inside one where she'd kept her father's papers through everything. She pulled out a single folded document. She'd written it before dawn in the overhang by firelight while he slept against the rock. Her handwriting was not elegant, but it was clear. She set it on the wagon board between them. He picked it up. Read it. Read it again. It was a land certificate. Both names across the top. The full acreage of the Blackwood Ridge farm split equal held joint. You did the harvest, she said. Stay and help me plant. The wind moved through the spruce along the depot road. His coat shifted. He looked at the paper for a long time, and his face did what it did, that small controlled stillness, but his hands, still wrapped in strips of her underskirt, held the paper the way you hold something you are not going to put down. He folded it once, put it in his breast pocket against his chest. Ground'll be soft, he said once the snow clears. She climbed up onto the wagon bench. Then we'd better get back before it freezes again. He untied the horses and climbed up beside her and turned them north toward the ridge, toward the limestone slope that had nothing on it that either of them couldn't handle. And the wagon rolled forward into the cold, bright morning and did not stop.